What we can now do is start to look at some evaluation points. So there could be a couple of questions you get in this area. One could be about evaluating and describing the theory, and one could be about describing and evaluating the research. So we need to be prepared for both. So what we're going to do over the next couple of slides is think about the research of McGowan and McDonald, that supporting research, and try and see if we can apply our strengths and weakness evaluation point to this particular experiment. We're then going to do a little bit of work on those 9-mark questions and start to come up with some plans and thinking about what we would include in each of those different types of 9-mark questions. Okay, so again, this is now a chance for you to have a think on your own about the evaluation points, and hopefully you're now getting quite familiar with the strengths and the weaknesses of experiments and being able to apply them, because we're now looking at those same evaluation points. So how can we talk about control in this experiment as a positive? How does it improve the McGowan and McDonald's research and therefore strengthen the support that the interference theory has? Also, how can we look at the absence of realism in experiments? What doesn't this truly reflect in everyday life? And what issue does that create for the research? So have a go, and if this is a typed kind of process you're going through, it's dead easy. Just have a typed go at writing up these before I kind of talk through the examples of the evaluation points and see how close you can get to that, because your ability to apply these will really help you as a student rather than just sort of learning them through the information I give you every time. So have a go at writing these up first. When you've had your own go at it, then press play again and I'll talk through the different points you could make about each. So let's look at strength first and let's look at control. Well, if we think about this experiment, they were able to control all of those conditions. They were able to control the learning of the original list. Remember, they were quite strict and said that they would just keep the participants going with the learning phase until they could get 100% recall. So that level of control meant that they could be fairly certain this information had been learned at the start. They also could control what went onto those additional information word lists. So they could make sure that it stayed relatively consistent with the original words. They could make sure that it didn't present any unfair help for the participants through the words or items they chose for those additional lists. They could also control the environment, and by that we mean the setting, the place that the participants were in when they did the experiment. So this means they were able to ensure there were no additional distractions. They could give out the instructions in exactly the same way each time, so they could make it all really nicely standardised. So all of those things kept this really high level of consistency and meant that there wasn't a lot of other factors that could influence the performance of the participants other than the additional items they gave them. And because of this, it makes us more confident that where the participants got worse at remembering the words, and where having an additional list made them worse than not having an additional list, we can be fairly sure that's down to interference rather than any other factors that could have affected their memory during that experiment. Okay, so see how this matches up with your original response to this task, and see now whether you can go through and have a look and add any additional information into this box in your writing frame. When you feel like you've done as much as you can, click play again and we'll move on to the weaknesses. Right then, so for the weakness, we're going to again look at realism. And when we say realism here, we're talking about the fact that experiments that are conducted in a lab are suggested to have issues and problems with being realistic. So in this particular experiment, like the other experiments we've looked at in this unit, like the Murdoch research, the information was given to them only because they were taking part in this experiment. It wasn't things that they had to learn as part of their everyday life or work or school. It was things that they were given specifically to take part in these tasks. So we've got a gap between what would be a real life memory scenario and the scenario that played out in this experiment. They also, remember, knew that they were taking part in an experiment. So they sat there in that room being aware that their performance was being measured, and also probably knowing that there was something going on with the experiment that they were being tested on. Now, both of these things means that we have potential variation between how the individuals performed during the experiment to how people might respond in everyday memory tasks. And this is an issue. As psychologists, we don't want to just study how people behave in test conditions. We are interested very much in everyday behaviour. So when these everyday scenarios aren't included within experiments like this, it's much harder to generalise those results. Okay, so again, like you did for the strengths, have a look at what you thought could be a good development for realism as an evaluation point. And if there's any additional information that you can grasp from this slide, add it into your weakness box that you've got. When you're happy to press play again, we'll start looking at these essay questions. Right then, so let's think about then 9-mark questions that might come up on this topic. So by doing the Murdoch one, we've had our chance of looking at what 9-mark questions could be. Now, for me, there's 2 potential 9-mark questions that could come from this topic. You could get asked to describe and evaluate the interference theory. So you could be asked to go through what is the interference theory and how can we evaluate its strengths and limitations. Also though, you could get a question asking you to describe and evaluate research into the interference theory, where the focus of that question is going to be on the experiment we've learned rather than the theory itself. So I'm just going to talk through both of these with you and just give you some guidance on how to focus on the right aspect of the question and make sure that when you do a question next lesson, and we will do one of these questions in our next lesson, that you are prepared for the type of information that you'd be expected to give for this type of response. Okay, so let's look at this first one then, and the idea of describe and evaluate the interference theory of forgetting. It's absolutely critical that when you're reading questions, you're very carefully identifying the focus of the question. And in this question, the focus is on the theory itself. So this is somebody coming up to you and saying, tell me about the interference theory, and now tell me what's good and what's not so good about it. So if the focus is on the theory, in my description part, I now need to be talking about those definitions. What is interference? How does it influence memory? And remember, when we do that, there were some key terms there that I asked you to try and use to make sure your definition was as effective as possible. So using the key terms similar, compete, prevent will help make that an effective definition. If you're looking to achieve top marks for a 9-mark question, a further bit of detail about the theory, such as the types of interference, what they are and what some examples of them are, will be that necessary information to push you higher up to get higher marks for the description part. When it comes to evaluate this, we need to think, well, what are the good things and not so good things about the interference theory? Well, one good thing is that we've got research evidence that backs it up, the theory. So we can use the McGurk-McDonald research to be able to now show that this interference effect does happen when we test participants. Now remember, we also know some evaluation points about the research. So this is a way of elaborating and extending your evaluation here, because you can also say that the research that supports the interference theory is really good because it's been conducted under highly controlled conditions. But you can also say that the interference theory and the research that supports it isn't that great because it lacks the realism we'd expect to be able to represent real-life memory behaviour. So notice how we're using these final evaluation points here. The control part is saying that evidence that supports the theory is really good. The realism one is saying the evidence that supports the theory isn't so good. Now, when we move into the second question, we're now describing and evaluating the research. Notice the focus has changed, that we're not on the theory anymore, that we want to describe and evaluate the research itself. So when we describe, what do we need to describe? Well, we need to describe the McGurk-McDonald research. So this is where we'd now cover the aim, the method, the results and the conclusion of McGurn Macdonald's research. You would write about this research in much more detail here than when you're using it to evaluate, because you're going to talk through every little point to make sure that your description's nice and thorough. When you're only using it to evaluate, you just focus on the results and the conclusion. When it comes to evaluation, well, this is where we talk about the good things about the research, the fact that it was controlled, and we talk about some of the issues with the research, such as the fact that it lacks realism. So notice it's a lot of the same material, but we just want to get that focus right, that we're describing the right thing and we're using the right evaluation points. Okay, so for this bit, do now complete those planning tables. Feel free to go back, compare, have a real think about the focus of each question and how I've laid out the description and evaluation points. As I said there, when we come back to our next lesson, which is a week on Monday, I am going to set you one of these 9-mark questions. So it is important that you've got these plans in place, and as a homework task, I'm going to ask you to look through them and make sure that you can recall the key pieces of information for each one so that you can do those particular questions successfully. Okay, so that brings us to the end of this lesson today. Hopefully that's been useful and will allow you now to RAG those 2 topics within your personal learning checklist. So make sure that you finish off this lesson by going back to that. Think about how well you understand those actual theories of interference, and then think about the research into interference. For both of those, you need to be able to evaluate. So do work that into your process and think about how confident you'd be with these 9-mark questions next week. That'll be an indication of whether you feel you are green, really confident you could write a 9-mark question now. Amber, you could give it a go, but you're still not wholly confident. Or red, you're really struggling. If you are red for these topics, then it's the point where you need to get in touch with me and be able to ask me for a little bit more help for that. And I can even do a couple of little breakout sessions next Monday to support you if you're really confused with this 9-mark question. And unless you tell me you're struggling, then I can't include you within those breakout groups. So do make sure that you flag up to me when you submit your work, whether you're finding this topic particularly difficult.